session we have this morning is how we can make the private rental system work for low-income renters. I'm very excited to be joined by these two women to my left. They are excellent human beings. I have the privilege to have worked with both of them over the years. Not only do they have excellent brains, they have wonderful hearts, and I know that they are both experts in their fields, but also most importantly, they really do care about making our society fairer and more equitable. I'll introduce them in more detail in a moment, but I just wanted to provide a bit of context for this session. So I'm assuming you've come here because you already know that there is something flawed with our rental system. There has been yet another highlight this week highlighting how virtually no rentals are now affordable, particularly in Sydney, but we know this is an issue across the state. So pre-pandemic, we had around 20% of rentals that cost less than $400. Now, we have only 2%. So we know rents have been increasing roughly 30% over the time period since the pandemic. And the regular Anglicare rental affordability snapshot shows us that virtually none of the properties that are out there are affordable, particularly for someone on income support payments. But the struggle is also there for single-parent families, for people on the minimum wage. And it's very much the people that you are assisting in your communities that are seeing firsthand the impact of our rental affordability crisis. On top of the rental affordability challenges we face, there are also issues around security and quality. And John touched on this in our opening plenary, just saying it's not just about housing affordability, but actually one of the things that we need to also be talking about is security. So that we're not just a tenant isn't just going to be evicted tomorrow, that they know that they have a place that they can call home on a day. And Yolanda also mentioned the challenges around, particularly in social housing, about how the amenity for a lot of those properties isn't really up to standard. And we know that some of these challenges also apply across the private rental market. So properties that are riddled with mould, properties that are too hot in summer or too cold in winter, properties that aren't in a good state in repair. I was going to ask our member Dennis from Broken Bay. Unfortunately, he's sick with COVID, so he hasn't been able to join us. But in our Social Justice Committee several months ago, he shared a story of a family that he's assisting who have been living in a shipping container. No windows, no ventilation, paying $400 a week. Wow. These stories aren't uncommon for our members to be hearing about and supporting people with. I'm just going to read you out a case study that another member has shared with us. And I have changed the names. So Sarah is a single mum of 3 young boys, including a child with special needs. Prior to moving into her current home, Sarah had long periods of homelessness after escaping a violent relationship. Sarah's been living in private rental accommodation for the last 4 years, with her rent subsidised through a community housing provider. She's about to be evicted from her home in a few weeks because the owner wants to sell the property, and Sarah has no idea where she will go. This is a quote from Sarah. She said, "We'd finally had the stability in our family home for the last 4 years. It's been a lifeline for me and my kids. I couldn't have imagined them having their own room, having space, even having a kitchen and a proper bed, not sleeping on the floor like I had done. But now when I look at the private rental market, I feel physically ill. I really want to stay in this area, but I just can't afford it. But then nowhere else is affordable either. For me, community is everything. I don't have family that can help me. Not having a home as a foundation is exhausting. Constantly moving is constant trauma. I lie awake every night stressing about a home and everything over my children's heads." So that's the not so good news, and I know these stories are common for all the people that you're assisting. Where I think there is a little bit of hope, and Graham spoke about needing to have hope, is that at the last state election, we saw both political parties finally start to recognise renters' rights as a key issue. And with the election of the new Labor government in New South Wales, we have seen the appointment of the state's first rental commissioner, and I'm very grateful that she has chosen to be with us today.
Hello everyone, thanks very much for your time today. Thank you, Solange, for the warm introduction. So before I begin, I would also like to acknowledge the Camargue people and pay my respects to elders past, present and emerging. I also wanted to say thanks to you on a personal note because I'm from Ireland and we have a very strong network of St Vincent de Paul volunteers there as well. And I can say that I was on the receipt of that kindness for a long time throughout my childhood. And as a result of that, and I'll give you one example, we lived in a single parent household. We grew up in a social housing community in Ireland, in the west of Ireland, in a place called Galway. And first we were in the flats and then it kind of moved to the houses. There was a big change there. And my mum had this person that would come to the house all the time and she would say that that's my friend, and it was Anthony. We later found out he was a volunteer for St Vincent de Paul. And Anthony would always call up and bring up whether it would be a box of food or come up and have a chat. And he became a really good friend to our family. Sorry, I didn't mean to get emotional, but I did want to say this, and I will stop getting emotional, because it's so important. So before we say anything today, I just want to say thank you. Right, let me get my bearings, because I didn't expect to do that. Okay, so my job is the first time that we've ever had a job like this in New South Wales. And as the Rental Commissioner, I've set out for a mission to make renting fair, quality and affordable. And I want to talk to you about why those things are so important. Sometimes it's called the renting triangle. I don't know if you've heard this, it's been on the radio, or look, you're out there, you're living it. People say you can never get all three, right? You can have something that you can afford, but it's generally not in good condition. You can have a good landlord, but it's maybe not affordable. It's just people find it really difficult. So I've really focused to make sure that not only can you get something that you can afford, but it's actually a home and somewhere you can be proud to live in. So I want to talk to you guys today about some of the challenges. We know what they are, but I think a foundational understanding of the evidence is helpful. I want to talk to you about what the government is doing to change things and what I'm doing in my role as Rental Commissioner. And I also want to talk to you about maybe some resources that you can use to help people when you're out in people's homes. Okay. So this is a bit of a snapshot of our rental market. I might just stand in here. Just to give you a bit of a sense, when we talk about the rental market in New South Wales, it's the biggest rental market in the country. Okay, we've got over 2 million renters, 1 million households. We hold about $2 billion of bonds, so that's when you pay your deposit to move in. We've got about 620,000 landlords. Most landlords only have less than 3 properties, and most landlords only keep their houses for up to 6 years. So it's really hard to sometimes convince landlords to invest in their properties because they're often selling them at a high rate. We've got about 89,000 strata schemes, and about 50% of people that live in strata schemes are renters. So it's a very high volume of renters in that type of housing. And they're often not empowered to be part of the decision making as well. So that can be a challenge. Key stats today. Oh yeah. In terms of leases, and I will talk to this a little bit as well, most lease agreements are about 1.6 years of a rental agreement. Now most people rent for about 12 years, and that's if they can buy. A lot of people can't. And the people that we're talking about today will probably rent for their whole lives. So they're having to move every year and a half pretty much. And it's very expensive as well to move, and causes a lot of stress to people, and trying to find schools and close to transport and all of those things are really contributing to people's mental health issues and well-being, and not in a positive way. So what I want to talk about is a little bit about who the renters are now. Once upon a time, renting was like students. It was the young, carefree, mobile, on the way to home ownership. That's just not the case now. 1 in 3 people who rent, 1 in 3 people rent in New South Wales, and in some areas this is really high. Like in Sydney, for example, 65% of people are renters. In areas like Brewarrina, if you're in regional New South Wales, 55% of people are renters. So in regional areas and in urban areas, renters are increasing. You've heard the term generation rent. Well, expect that to settle in, because over 51% of the people who do rent are families with dependent children. And like I said, many will rent for their whole lives. We're also seeing a growing number of older renters, people over 60, and that number has grown by 19% and is vastly accelerating. And this group is very vulnerable in the rental market because of all the moves that you have to do, and also because they're very subject to rent changes and rent increases, and they're often on a fixed planned income. So more people are renting, and they're renting for longer, and the demographics and the profile of renters are changing. And this is coming at a time when we've had record declines in home ownership rates. So I think this is really important, because renting was the secondary tenure. It was the thing you did on the way to home ownership. We really have to reimagine that now, because some people will rent for their whole lives. So we have to ask ourselves, is our rental market in a position for someone to rent their whole lives in it? Because right now it's not. It's not. I think I've talked already about the deposits. So it's taken people about 12 years to have a deposit, and that's right now if they're in the working, if they're in the working world and they're out there in the rental market. But if you're a school leaver right now, they're saying it'll take 44 years to save a deposit for a house. Now, when I left school, I thought I'd pay my mortgage off by the time I was in my 60s, not raise a deposit to get one. So it's just going to really lock people out of the ability to access home ownership. So what does that mean for our market in general? So some of the challenges, I talked about the renting triangle. So when we think about fairness, what does fairness look like? Well, fairness is not the same response for every single person, is it? Fairness is about getting a response that you need for where you're at with your life, okay? Now when it comes to the rental market, renters get the tip of the scales, and it's often against them. It's not because all landlords are bad, and it's not renters versus landlords, but the system does set renters up to experience a lot less fairness. Examples are like, you have to ask if you want to put a baby gate up in the property, even if you've got depthly stairs. Now the landlord can't refuse, but you do have to ask for that permission. You're constantly going to ask. You have to ask if you want to have repairs, and you're not sure if the agent will pass that information on to the landlord, and sometimes the communication isn't very transparent. Actually, I would say most times the communication is not very transparent. When we look at issues in the rental market, we get 160,000 contacts a year in government for tenancy inquiries. We also fund the Tenants Union, they get a further 30,000 inquiries. So this is a major issue to the community. Of those inquiries, the majority are complaints about repairs and maintenance. Now we get 70% representations from renters about those issues. And the remedy is often to go to the NCAT tribunal. It costs $50 and you can go there and get your matter heard. But who takes the issues to NCAT? It's landlords, not renters. They often feel like they can't raise that matter in a tribunal. They've got too much going on. There's too much going on at home. They're dealing with the poverty issues. It's the last thing on the list. So they put up and shut up in very dangerous conditions. And that's why we end up with a quality issue. And the quality, and it's not their fault, but this is the kind of issue that's underlying in the system. When we talk about quality, and John and I have this conversation actually all the time, you have to get your car to be roadworthy, but we don't have to get our rental properties to be rent-worthy. You can go in and inspect the property, you can fill out a condition report, there can be mould on the walls, there can be this, there can be that. You can just say, noted, bad condition, here's the keys. No one has to do anything, right? And you just hand it back, noted, bad condition, thanks for that. So that's not really a good standard in terms of quality. We also have huge energy efficiency issues. More people die of the cold in Australia than they do in Sweden, right? And we're coming into winter. So our houses are effectively like tents in some circumstances, and people can't afford to buy the electric blankets or the run the gas heaters or run the heaters during winter because of the electricity bill shock that they may face. So quality becomes a huge issue, and it's a difficult one for landlords too, because when I talk to them and I say, will you make these investments? We're talking about $50,000 worth of investments sometimes in some cases, and they say, can't afford that. And my plan is to sell the property within 5 years because my money will be made in the capital growth, not in the rent that I actually receive. Because New South Wales has the lowest rental yields in the country. We have the highest rates of investors, but that's because we've got the highest capital growth, so the highest money earned over time when your property just grows from value. And this leads into affordability. So affordability is a number of factors impacting that, but what I will say, and we'll talk about it in a minute, is we've had the worst record of affordability in 17 years right now, and that is playing out in devastating impact to people in the community. So when I'm talking about fairness, I've talked about some of these things, but the fairness point is really about having limited choice and control under the law. And one example is pets, right? So homeowners can have pets. Pets bring well-being, they bring a lot of happiness, they bring companionship, they bring good health. Dogs can lower stress, cats are good company. You know, these are things that really help people out. But if you're a renter, you can't really get access to a pet, and that's one of the key reform areas that we're working on right now, among others. But it's a kind of an example of why can 76% of homeowners have a pet, but less than 35% of renters can have a pet, right? Because there's just not the properties available. There's all sorts of knock-on impacts to that too. Impacts around domestic and family violence, impacts around homelessness, where people do not want to part with their animal because the person is very important to them, the pet's very important to them, understandably. And I've talked about NCAT and uncertainty as well. I mean, the other issue, and I talked about this as well, is mould, issues of standards of the housing. All of these are contributing factors with minimal remedies under the law, and that's something I'm looking very closely at. And this is just the graph. I mean, I don't know if you can really see that, but just you can take it as that red arrow here on the right-hand side. The median household, that's like the median household right now in New South Wales can only afford 39% of advertised rentals. So most people can't afford most rentals. And those on the lowest income are really heavily impacted. One of the key issues I would say is there's a misconception that if you're low income, you rent out the low income properties. What's happening is people who want to get out of the rental market are renting out the low income properties because they're saying, I used to rent maybe 600, 700, 800 a week because that suited me. I can live where I want to live, near the train somewhere, maybe a bit more of an expensive suburb. But I don't want to do that anymore. It's so difficult to get into home ownership. I will move away from those suburbs to cheaper suburbs because I need to get out of the rental market and I want to buy. So people on higher incomes are much more competitive on paper, and then they go up against a very low income family, single parent, whatever it might be, and they have no chance. So it's not that you have an equal distribution of affordable properties and income. It doesn't work like that. It's not fair, and it's inherently impacting those on the lowest income. Okay, so what can we do about it? And I'll talk to you about my agenda. So I'm making renting fair by changing the law, making sure the laws are fit for purpose, and making recommendations to government across every aspect of renting to make it better for people, for renters and for landlords. And when I say for landlords, I mean by providing clarity and certainty about which way they can operate. When I talk about quality, we're talking about improving the minimum standards and energy efficiency standards of property and making more information available to people so they can make better choices about the rental market. When I talk about affordability, we're delivering the first ever portable rental bond scheme. I said to you that people move about every year and a half. It costs people about $4,000 to move. So we're going to set up a scheme where you can port your bond from one house to another and you just have to pay the difference. So you don't have to raise both of those things. Because I'm sure you would have helped a lot of people raise the money to move, but they're also going to payday lenders and it's putting them in terrible financial situations. And I'm also a very strong advocate for social and affordable housing, and social housing in particular is the best way to deliver affordability in the private rental market because it supports the 70% of people who are waiting for social housing in the private rental market to have secure quality homes. So investment in social housing is critical to the success of the overall private rental market. I'll say that. So how are we going about this? So we've gone out to the community to say we want to make these changes. What do we need to do? Here's some ideas about how we think we can get there. What do you think about that? We had 16,000 survey responses, 400 long form submissions, and it broke records. We got more responses than the federal government's inquiry into renting. This is an issue that is really important to people in New South Wales. We also had renter and landlord roundtables, and I did those myself so I could speak directly to people and understand what exactly is your perspective on this and how can we make changes. We had engagement with about 65 agencies as well, some of which are in the room today, including St. Vincent de Paul. So in addition to sort of listening to the big agencies and the renters and the landlords, I've also made sure that I'm hearing from marginal voices like Ageing on the Edge, like the youth panels, like hearing directly from Aboriginal organisations, hearing directly from domestic violence services, and tenant-led organisations as well. Because I see my job as not the person who's got all the ideas, but even though I do love a chat, you can tell, but my job is to get out there and listen to people so that I can carry back the views to the decision makers who are the elected representatives. So we can carry back the stories. Like me hearing today that somebody's in a shipping container, that's against the law. So we want to provide support to that family. Firstly, that's not allowed. And secondly, nobody should be profiting on somebody's misery in that environment. So the other thing that we do as well as going out to do the consultation, to make recommendations to change the law, is we fund the Tenants Advocacy and Advice Service. Now, Jemima's here today, so I won't get too much into this, but we fund that from the interest earned from the bond account. So all the money that we hold on behalf of residents in New South Wales earns interest when it's in the account, and so we use that money, $28 million a year, to fund programmes. One of them is the Tenants Advocacy and Advice Service, and that's across the whole state, and they provide case management and support. And they're probably the best first port of call if you've got a difficult scenario with the person that you're helping out. For more general information, I'd encourage you to contact us at Fair Trading, but something that you might need to go to NCAD or has a bit more complexity with it, you want to make sure that you've got someone who can take the time alongside yourself to support the family or the individual, and the Tenants Advocacy Service are really well equipped to do that, specifically for Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander families as well. Alright, so what are we doing about all of these challenges? So first and foremost, we're ending no grounds eviction in New South Wales. So there's a no grounds eviction issued about every 18 minutes in New South Wales right now. And what that does is it just undermines people's confidence in the rental market. So what we're proposing and making recommendations on is that there would be reasonable grounds to end a tenancy. It's not to say to a property provider you can't access your property. That's not going to work, okay? It's to say, if that property is staying on the rental market and the person living in that property is paying their bills and living in a responsible way that's not infringing on the rights of you or others, and just paying their rent, that they can stay in that property. Now, if you need the property back, if there's an issue in your family life or you're selling the property, whatever, that's a different discussion. But if that property is staying on the rental market and someone's paying their bills, they should be able to stay there, right? And that's the kind of principle intention behind that. And if they have to go, you tell them why, and that's respect. And that's where we're trying to get to in terms of fairness in the rental market. The other thing that we're doing is making sure that we've got free ways to pay so that people don't get caught up in these debit scenarios where they end up having to pay every time they want to pay their rent. That's not good. And we have to make sure that they're convenient, that they're not just some ridiculous thing that makes somebody bring cash to a post office one day a week or something. So it needs to be easy for people to pay. We're closing loopholes around the rent increases. So you can only increase the rent once every 12 months, okay? And we're also making it easier for renters to have pets. So in that scenario, a landlord could only refuse a pet if there was very solid ground, like maybe the pet's dangerous, or the matter's been discussed by NCAP. So we need to work that all through, but that's the sort of intention of where we're coming from and the feedback that we've heard so far from the community. We're also working on protecting tenants' data, and I'm right in the middle of this work right now. So we've got an industry reference group set up who are going to lock down the application forms. So the only questions that a person can be asked when they're renting is questions that they absolutely need to be asked. I've had examples where people are asked if they have tattoos, they're asked for 3 years of bank statements, they're asked for their social media account. It's got nothing to do with whether you can rent the property or not, right? How many children do they have? As long as the occupants don't exceed the safe amount of people in the house, why is that relevant? So all of these things open up the book for discrimination, and we're trying to reduce and eliminate that as much as possible to give people a genuinely fair go. And we're also making sure that there's protections for that data when it is collected. I just want to give you one example. Take Bankstown in February, right? There was 135 properties for rent in Bankstown in February, just in that month. There was 3,600 seriously interested renters for those properties. Most of them would have filled in a whole application form, given 2 forms of ID. They're then held by all of those agents, and of course 135 people will get the properties. So when you start to think about the risk in terms of people's data, security, and all of the things they have to put themselves at risk at just to be a renter, it's not fair. So that's one of the things that we're really focused on changing. We're also looking at the domestic violence provisions and making sure that if you're experiencing domestic violence, we already have protections, but we want to strengthen those even further and make sure that if you need to leave a rental property because of domestic violence, you won't be penalised, and it's going to be easier for you to do that. We have some protections, but I think we can do a little bit more there. Yes, and we're looking at boarding house accommodation as well. I worked in homelessness for a long time and boarding houses for a long time. I'm particularly passionate about this. I'm very obviously concerned with the standard of some of those homes, and I'm very passionate about making sure that we're working closely with fire and rescue and local governments to get that right. So this is a bit of our fair trading strategy. I won't spend too much time on this, but what I want to say to you is I work within the Department of Fair Trading, and our focus is to make sure that we have fair marketplaces, and renting is a marketplace. And that means that consumers are informed and empowered, and that traders are doing the right thing. And in this case, the traders are the property providers. And they tell me too that they want to do the right thing, but they don't know where to go. They say, oh, we don't know the tenants unions for the renters, the real estate institutes for the agents. We're worried if we call fair trading that we're in trouble. So I'm really working hard to change that message. Fair trading is here to help. If you've got a question, we'd rather you get the right answer than do the wrong thing and then end up in NCAT or with a tenant that's in a difficult spot. So give us a call if you do know people who are landlords. If you're speaking to people in your wider networks, please tell them, come to us for information. That's what we're here for. And we're only prosecuting and following compliance for people who are doing the wrong thing. We're here to help people to get things right. So the key focuses for us for the next 12 months are going to be ending solicited rent bidding. And this is where, I don't know if you've seen this when you have people look for rentals, sometimes you'll say price to and from for the rental. That's illegal. If you see that, please let me know. That is 100% illegal. We're trying to stamp that out as much as we can. We're very focused on that, and we've got a very strong data intelligence approach to that. The second thing that we're looking at is repairs and maintenance. Like I said, I'm very concerned about the quality of homes, and we're making sure that, one, we've got to make sure we've got the right remedies under the law, and two, that they're actually enforced. And third one we're looking at, subject to legislation changing, will be once the legislation changes, when there's reasonable grounds to evict a person, we're going to have to make sure that they're complied with. That people don't say to us, oh, I'm renovating, but then a week later move someone else in. Right? So we're going to have to look at that really closely and make sure that most people will do the right thing, but for the people who don't, we will be there to show them that that's not okay. And I just wanted to point everyone to our new website as well. This has been a labour of love for me since I started in the role 9 months ago. Our old website was difficult to navigate, it was a bit clunky, it was a lost cavern of information. So we've brought it all together, and it's really easy to navigate. So if you start a tenancy, during a tenancy, or ending a tenancy, you can quickly jump on there and support people. I know not everyone's using that, but it's the first port of call. But you can also phone us, and you can also go to Service New South Wales with any questions about renting. So if there is any concerns or any questions, please do not hesitate to get in touch with us. And here's all my details if there's anything that you want to raise with me. Thank you for what you do. Thank you for listening. And I look forward to the discussion. Thanks.
Thank you, Trina. It is a difficult gig to come into a new role at the best of times, but to come into a whole new position, and particularly on a topic that has so many people care about and are passionate about, with a very diverse range of views. It's a tough gig, so we're really grateful that you've stepped into that role, particularly as someone who's come from this sector, and we'll thank you for sharing that with us today. I'm now going to hand over to Jemima Mowbray. So Jemima is the Policy and Advocacy Manager at the Tenants Union of New South Wales. Jemima has been working as a housing advocate for change for our rental housing system for over 10 years. She's passionate about housing justice, which I can attest to. She's a long-term renter, and she imagines she'll be renting for life. So we share something a bit familiar there, I think, Jemima. So Jemima, can you tell us a little bit from the Tenants Union perspective about what else do you think is really needed to make renting fair in New South Wales?
Thank you, everybody, and I'd like to also start by acknowledging that we're on unceded Gamaragal land today. It's worth noting that, so this is Gamaragal country, they are the traditional owners, but here, as across most of New South Wales, Aboriginal people will primarily be renting their homes, and that any of the issues that Trina has talked about and that I'll talk about are disproportionately impacting Aboriginal renters. So I think Solange and Trina have mentioned, I'm from the Tenants Union, but we're part of a wider network, and I think that's really great that Trina's let you know. I know you're hearing directly from people, you're assisting people, and we are the first port of call, especially for low-income renters, and when there's a challenge that has come up, please give us a call. So when I say we're part of a network, there are 19 services across the state, 15 generalist services, and 4 Aboriginal tenants advice and advocacy services where, so for your local area, you probably already know them, there'll be a local service, but you can find out the contact details for them on our website, and it's the network website, it's tenants.org.au. And there'll be on there there'll be a tab that says get advice, but there'll also be a little box, and you put your postcode in, or the postcode of the renter, and immediately your local service and the Aboriginal service for that area, their contact details will come up, and the number, the times that they're open. So practical advice, if you take one thing away, take away tenants.org.au, whole range of fact sheets, but also that get advice box that can connect you to your local service. I think Trina has done an amazing job of giving you a picture of what renting looks like at the moment in New South Wales. Probably don't need it, because even if you don't rent your home, I'm sure you have family members who rent, you're assisting people who are renting, your neighbours might rent, and everybody kind of knows what the housing crisis looks like right now. So Trina has run through some of the rental reforms that are on the table from the government. So I'm not going to spend a whole lot of time on those that she's already mentioned that they're doing work on, but I wouldn't be here from the Tenants Union talking about what needs to happen without mentioning the reforms around evictions provisions that we have, or eviction law at the moment. You guys here have probably been involved in the campaign that really pushed both our current government and the coalition government to recognise that when you're in your home, it just seems reasonable, it just seems common sense that if you're being forced to move, as Trina mentioned the costs of moving, because we've done estimates around this, it costs on average around $4,000 to move, and that's not including the bond. So that's a lot of resources that you have to kind of find all of a sudden if it's not your choice to move. So if you're being forced to move, it makes sense that you should be given a valid reason. And so that set of reforms to get rid of no grounds provisions, no grounds evictions provisions, to be able to end tenancies without having to provide a reason, it's our key priority. Because it hits, I think you probably saw the numbers up there, 30,000 people, 30,000 renting households every year will get that, will get an eviction notice. So it stops you from asserting really reasonable rights, and probably rights that my landlord would like me to bring up. You know, they want to know if there's some damage to the property, but I feel a little bit worried about raising it with them, and I might be the most informed renter in the state. So I think that kind of that's the big one, and I know that government is doing work on it, but I did want to speak to it a little bit because there is progress happening, but I'm also aware that the thing that is stopping it happening sooner is government is still considering how will we do this. And one of the questions they have is, you guys might be aware, when you're renting, you might be on a fixed term tenancy, you've got a lease in place, or once that lease ends, you're in a periodic tenancy. So the majority of renters in New South Wales are on a fixed term tenancy, 12-month, 6-month lease. They're not very long leases here in New South Wales. It's around 58% of renters are on a fixed term lease. The rest of us are on periodic tenancies. And government is thinking, should we just do reform and make sure we get rid of no grounds for those who are on periodic tenancies? Or should we apply it for everybody? So they're considering whether or not the end of a fixed term is a reason in and of itself. So you could get an eviction notice, and just because your lease is ending, you haven't done anything wrong, the landlord isn't changing the use. Trina shared a really important principle. If the landlord is changing what they're doing with the property, if they need to move in or if they want to do big renovations, that's a change in the use. Somebody can't continue to live there. But if the lease is ending and they're going to continue having the property in the rental market, then there's not really a good reason that is being shared at the time with the tenant as to why that tenancy is ending. So an important question that's in front of government right now is, are we going to apply those reforms to get rid of eviction for no reason for just those in periodic tenancies, or should we include fixed term as well? So we mentioned that big number, 30,000. Trina mentioned what that looks like in practice is one person every 18 minutes is getting an eviction. That's 3 an hour. Of those 3 people during this session who will get an eviction, 2 of those households are on fixed term tenancies, because not only are they the majority of renters in New South Wales, but they are more likely to get a no grounds eviction during their tenancy. So from our perspective, it's so important that government gets this right, and when they do that reform that they can see is really important, that they apply it for all renters. So it's worth, I wanted to raise it because it's a live discussion, and it's certainly worth raising with your community members and with your decision makers when they start talking about that reform. So another couple of things that I think Trina gestured to, but that we haven't talked a whole lot about. The first one is, how are we really going to make an impact for people who are on low incomes in the private rental market? Investment in public and community housing. It's key. It helps the people when we increase the number of public and community housing homes that we have in our communities. We're taking people off that wait list. We all know the numbers of the wait list. It's over 50,000 in New South Wales. And we're giving them a home. And they're out of the private rental market, which is a terrifying place to be. But it also reduces the pressure. When we do it at scale, when we do it in a good way, it reduces the pressure in the private rental market for those people who are on low incomes. And I remember when I first started in this role, Solange mentioned I've been doing it for over 10 years, I went to like a housing economics for non-economists series. Actually, it's run by Shelter. And Professor Nicole Gurran, you might have seen her in the news recently. She's a commissioner for the People's Commission on Housing. She's excellent. I remember her describing to me, or describing to us in the room, I wish I had a one-on-one with Professor Nicole Gurran, but she was describing, we often think about social housing as a safety net for people. You know, it catches you when you need it, and it's there to help you. What we need to do is think about it as a safety net for our housing system. When we don't have enough social housing in our housing system, we don't have the appropriate protections in place. It does not create the safety net that we need for the market. And so I think if you think about it, it makes perfect sense. When somebody who is a low-income household actually gets housing, in public housing, it reduces that pressure in the rental market. It also, when we have best practice public and community housing providers, it actually sets up a little bit of a challenge for providers of lower or more affordable housing in the private rental market. If we could look to our public and community housing providers to provide really good quality homes, then lower income people would actually be challenging their investors in the private market to do better, and that's what we want to see. That's a big target that we're working towards. You guys at Binnies and we share an ask, and that is to get our housing stock to around 10% of social housing, 10% of our overall housing stock, should be social housing. At the moment, we have around just under 5% of people who are, of households in New South Wales are in social housing, so we kind of need to double that. And the realistic goal that we have tried to put to government is 5,000 new social housing homes every year, and then scale that up as we can so that we're hitting that 10% of overall stock mark. So, those are things that you've probably heard about. You might have heard about this too. It's been in the public conversation, but it hasn't had the focus from New South Wales government. The last thing that I wanted to mention was really thinking about how we could better regulate rents for people in the private rental market. So, what do I mean by that? It means one of the ways that we regulate rents at the moment is we have a limit on the number of times you can actually have a rent increase. If you are in a periodic agreement, you can only have one every 12 months. That's the limit. What we are seeing in New South Wales is really steep increases for people in sitting tenancies. Trina showed you some of the advertised or market rents at the moment. Our median rent in New South Wales is $660 a week. In Sydney, that looks like $715 a week. In regional New South Wales, it's around $500. Just in a yearly change, that's 20% increase in Sydney. It's 4% increase in the regional areas. That sounds lower, but what that hides is that during COVID, regional rents just increased a whole lot, and they've kept increasing, but at a slower rate. In Sydney, they dropped a tiny bit, and now they're catching up. So they've got these really steep increases. Those are market rents or advertised rents. Sitting rents, people who are in existing tenancies normally have slightly lower rents, but landlords are seeing what the market is doing and trying to catch up. So it's hard for us to measure exactly the percentage increase that people are seeing in sitting tenancies or existing tenancies, but I'd actually suggest that they might even be starting to get higher in the last 12 months, or at least getting to a comparable level as to what our advertised rents are looking like. We're hearing stories of people having 20-30% increases. And that, if you think about what that looks like for a household, when you get a hit to say you have to find another 20% of your rent, so what could that look like? Next $120, $130. It's a very tricky thing to think, where is that going to come? What am I going to take out of my budget right now to make that rent increase? But people have to do it because you have to keep a roof over your head. We did research with Shelter last year on the different kinds of approaches that countries over in Europe, in North America have taken around regulating rents. And there are lots of different approaches. And so one thing that New South Wales government has been very focused on supply, and I think supply is key. It's part of the solution here, especially supply of public and community housing, but supply in general is absolutely something we need to be looking at and thinking about. But when you have a crisis like we're seeing at the moment, you want to have every tool on the table at your disposal. One of the things that we're not talking about, and that the government hasn't really talked about, is how we could better regulate rents, what we could do around some fair limits around rent increases. So that one limit at the moment is one a year, but it does not speak to how much that increase is. And I actually think that a lot of landlords would be happy if they had an understanding and an idea of what the increase might be. And we came together as a community to work out what would be a reasonable limit, what's a fair limit on how much you can increase rent. Maybe it's something tied to CPI, maybe it's so that there's a conversation, I think, that we haven't been having as a community around what it could look like to fairly regulate rents. So I'll leave it there. I think my final remark really is to sort of take a step back and reflect that as a community, I think what we really need to do in relation to thinking through what are the solutions here for the housing crisis is go back to basics. What is housing to us? What is its purpose? And I think most of us would think about housing. It's certainly something that we talk about. Housing is shelter. Housing is a place from which, you have a base to build a good and decent life and possibly flourish. I think that's really, when we go, what is housing? What should it be? That's what we think. But also part of our public conversation very much is that housing is an asset class, it's property, it's an investment. And there's an expectation that there's going to be a rate of return on the investment. I think when I say this and put those two out there, it's not that I don't think so far we have had those two things on the table. And they can be on the table together. But I think what we do need to do is say, what's our priority? Where do we want the outcomes? And what outcomes do we really need? Where do we place priority when we think about our regulation and our investment? And I think most of you in this room, suddenly I would be saying it's the former, it's the first, that is the priority. You can have the second, absolutely, but we have to meet the outcomes of the first, housing as a home. And that needs to guide our approach to how we set our laws, our tax settings, how we as governments invest.